Yes.
All right, good morning, everyone. We'll get started this moment. I can imagine. Yeah, this is the easiest place to get to. Oh, great. Good. Yeah. Congressman Doggett has been one of the leading voices in favor or in support of Bangladesh towards democracy, development, and human rights. So Congressman Doggett, we're very honored to have you here with us today. And again, thanks to all of our panelists, our speakers, all those who put in the hours to organize it, all of you who took the time out of your schedules to join us. Let me just say a word on our organizations and what brought us together. None of us are, I think, household names, our three organizations. We've all come together in very recent times, and this is the first event that we're doing collectively, and I'm certain it won't be the last. Each of our organizations in our own way has tried to raise awareness about what's happening in Bangladesh, about the opportunities to strengthen U.S.-Bangladesh relations, and again, that's why we're here today. We also, when we started planning this event, were conscious of the amount of disinformation and misinformation about Bangladesh that's out there. It's out there online, it's out there probably in the halls of Congress, it's out there in many drawing rooms in the United States and Bangladesh and elsewhere. We don't have an agenda in terms of pushing forward any political party, any Bangladesh entity, any American entity. We're here to provide information. So I'm confident that from our panelists, we hear a diversity of views, and that's a good thing. So if our panelists take a slightly different perspective on issues, you can tell that we're doing what we wanted to do. And it should go without saying, but I have no idea what any of the panelists were going to say. There was a time when I might have had some influence on what Dan Mazzino would say in public, but those days are long behind us. So both Dan and I, as retired diplomats, have the opportunity to speak our own minds and not worry so much about what the U.S. government wants us to say, because neither of us speak for the U.S. government. And for that matter, none of the panelists are speaking on behalf of any of the organizers. I think they'll tell you as well, they don't necessarily speak on behalf of the institutions or the organizations with which they're affiliated. What we've brought together is a group of really smart people who know Bangladesh well and care about Bangladesh to share some views. Farhana Sultana will go over kind of the run of show when she gets up here. But without further ado, I want to invite Rashid Tanvir Islam to the podium to introduce Congressman Doggett. Rashid.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all of you, and especially the organizers who make this event possible. It's very important that we, look back after what happened, last July, as part of our months of evolution and where we are today. And I'm looking forward to having great conversations and discussions. As a constituent of the Congressman Doggett's district and also a member of BRAIN, it's a personal privilege and honor for me to introduce him. I know Lloyd for a long period of time, and especially through the events and the activities that we do in local organization, Bangladesh Association of Greater Austin, and we had the privilege of having Dan there for a while back. Lloyd and his team has been tremendously supportive of our organization, and especially the our diaspora. Whenever you ask the office, for smaller needs, for our constituents in terms of immigration, in terms of venue, in terms of major issues that arise in our community, he's always been there. He and Libby always attends our events, and with special Bangladeshi attire, he was there in our Poila Boishakh event about a month ago. But one thing that we saw his genuine care about our organization and our people is last year during the July monsoon revolution, when our student organization from all the universities in Texas asked him to support. When we had a huge rally in the state capitol, his office helped us make sure that everything goes well. And then since then, I think most of you have seen his tweets. He was very vocal from the beginning, taking on the fascist regime, all the bad tactics and undemocratic norms that they were practicing. And he was forefront, and the voice on those tweets has been amazing and galvanized us to be, organized and then to protest all of those, terrible things that happened and resulting in too many deaths. But fortunately, we were successful, and that's because of the support from Lloyd and his office, and similar support from our elected officials. So without further ado, Lloyd, thank you so much for being here and helping. Your office was instrumental in getting us this venue and facilitating what we have today. So I appreciate it and thank you so much.
Delighted to join you this morning, and while there are a lot of other things going on here in Congress that pull me out of the session in a little while, Sarah Engelhardt from my office will be very involved in this. It is good to see advocates, congressional staff members, and those who care about what's happening on the other side of the earth. I was drawn to this cause because, well, I'm very, having only lived in the city all my life, I know the city has been strengthened by its ability to draw the best artists from all over the world, which I speak firsthand with my friend Rashid and a number of other members of the community, how much they have added strength and made my hometown a much better place. Our countries have a history of some shared values and shared terms, whether it's trade, with climate, security and development goals. And I believe one of the gifts that I got from Rashid was a Shahid Minar of the monument that is in Doggett. And it was also a reminder, as I see it each day, since 50 or so years, there have been people in Bangladesh, in that case, secret because of their language, Pakistan, who have been seeking freedom in the same kind of rights we expect to have here. And I believe our objective from gatherings like this is to remain committed to fully achieving the democratic promise that has been and it's not fully instilled for so long in Bangladesh. We know many of the details, and thanks to Right to Freedom for the role that you played in the effort to prevent a tyrannical ruler from engaging in tactics that favored her party and her clique to the detriment of so many others. I think for about 15 years, Bangladeshis saw corruption in plain sight. They saw security forces committing human rights violations with impunity, and their government making a mockery of elections. It's no surprise that many people who could not find an economic opportunity for themselves, who, when they graduated or were nearing graduation, could not find a job, were outraged by the quota system that was being reinstated despite their repeated protests. Ordinary citizens were able to accomplish something rather extraordinary that has happened in two other places on the earth in recent times, but at an enormous price. We can't forget the image of Abu Sayyid, probably not saying it right, with his arms outstretched. Kind of reminds us of after Tiananmen Square, that courageous person in the PRC standing in front of a tank. But the deaths there and the UN estimates that about 1,400 people may have been killed, many children, are troubling, as are the kidnappings and torture with electric shocks and beatings that occurred throughout that time. This brutality of Sheikh Hasina did not intimidate people into silence. It's really impressive how they flooded the streets and eventually forced her to flee. Hearing from Bangladeshi Texans, as Rashid said, and I think this probably happened in many other cities across America, that in a place as far from Dhaka as Austin, Texas, there were a large number of Bangladeshi Texans and allies who were at our state capitol to say we can stand for no more of this. I followed that as a result of that, contacted the State Department and was joined, pleased we're joined this morning by my friend Jim McGovern, who heads our human rights efforts. There are several of us. I think there may have been a little more interest there in maintaining close relations with India than in recognizing the sacrifice that was being made by young Bangladeshis. And while I think our country has a great interest in having India as a counterbalance to a very aggressive PRC, our policies in that region in South Asia and beyond cannot be so narrowly focused that the only thing that matters is what New Delhi thinks. 30 years ago, when I first came to Congress, one of the first caucuses I joined was the India caucus. But I'm increasingly concerned about the Modi government, its discrimination against, its attacks on the Muslim members of this community. When I joined the India caucus, the pride was in the diversity, the strength that India gets from that diversity. But what we've seen in recent years from the BJP has been policy that I view as completely contrary to that. The Trump administration, with its closure last Friday of the Human Rights Bureau of the State Department, has indicated how little it cares about human rights in our international policies. But those of us, whether in elected office or otherwise, who have been human rights advocates, have all the more reason to speak out forcefully. You indicated that there would be a diverse views. I'm very direct about this, what it means for our country. A prominent leader I saw recently is Islam. Over the last 15 years, people talk. Now they finally get a chance. What we should be about is giving and having policies encourage Bangladeshis to that chance and to secure the democracy and the freedoms that they have not been able to fully experience in the past. The Commission on Inquiry appearance was rightly extended, and it's important, I think, that India continue to be called to extradite Hasina for proper sentencing and being held accountable for crime. It's important that the voting here in Bangladeshi affairs. Strengthening the country's rule of law and its institutions, of course, benefiting from having a distinguished leader in Dr. Mohammed Yunus. He has rightfully worked with all parties, tried with this charter to try to move Bangladesh toward elections next year. I hope that can happen, and the foundation has been laid for more democracy. Another very great concern along this journey that we honor today is the trade between our two countries, and that's also recently faced some setbacks. Maybe watch a new title. Bangladesh is the third largest trading importer of apparel to this country, and it relies we rely on apparel from there. It is in Bangladesh that something like 80% of all export earnings are related to apparel, constituting about 10% of the entire gross domestic product of the country. We have been the largest foreign direct investor in Bangladesh, and its export market. The International Trade rightly ruled that the fact that Americans buy more goods from Bangladesh, we sell certainly that there's not a national policy, as the president declared with reference to our relations with Bangladesh. After 90 trade deals in 90 days, failing to produce two very incomplete deals, President Trump is now setting August 1st deadline for imposing tariff taxes on Americans and adversely affecting the exports coming out of Bangladesh. I don't believe anyone can win a trade war. We certainly are not winning that war. We're simply imposing more taxes and higher prices on American citizens and threatening some of our best lives. This threat to 35% tariff on Bangladesh in particular in 2 weeks will have the effect, if it stays in effect, with the strong garment sector, the thousands of people in Bangladesh that rely on them. Not dissimilar from the tragedy around the world from the termination of the United States Agency for International Development. I believe that it employed thousands of Bangladeshis who lost their job and the country loses $700 billion in really critical development assistance. Young people, not only in Bangladesh but many other parts of the world, are dead today because of abrupt termination. I sponsored legislation joining Jim on Congress congressional authority over which needs to be reestablished with what the courts have ruled, and hoping that the Senate this week will reject the rescissions on foreign programs. Bangladeshis have been also leaders with good reason on climate diplomacy. Denied at the White House. The administration is firing here of top scientists. It's degradation of the Environmental Agency, the National Weather Service, the latter having its impact near my home and just this past couple of weeks with the intense and the very late warnings about it. All of this related to our battle against the climate crisis, which is very real. We feel it today in DC. Bangladesh, of course, is very vulnerable to rising sea levels, to storms that have previously led to the deaths of so many people there, flooding. By 2050, it's estimated that 1 every 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced by climate change. They'll be among the climate refugees that are likely to flood the world. So after the hottest year on record in the world, the waves that are now flooding the east and Europe and all around the world mean we need climate action. It was good that it was Bangladesh action in the UN Human Rights Committee that led to a resolution which was approved, simplified procedures for developing countries to access global climate funds, of which we need so much more. Finally, I will say that what happened in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina is also a roadmap to what we want to avoid here in the United States. We've all taken pride in the fact that we are the world's longest democracy, most historic democracy. But I personally saw here on January 6th that that democracy is not guaranteed, that we have a responsibility to engage just as people in Bangladesh engage to ensure that democracy is guaranteed. So many of the practices that I've seen in recent months, whether it's ignoring courts, ignoring the Congress, dismissing the ethics office and inspector general that are our watchdogs over federal agencies, pardoning the January 6th felons, and concerted effort for one-man interference in the rule of our country is a reminder that we need to stand firm for our democracy and for our liberties and not see the undermining of democracy. So many Americans, certainly any who have a green card, but most particularly my Republican colleagues, are intimidated by what's happening in our country. But there are many Bangladeshis that are every as American as I, and I think it's very important that they participate just like every other citizen in speaking out and resisting tyranny. So much of what the mass movement did last July that we honored here today is what we need to continue. Truth on social media, protesting in peaceful ways to demonstrate that America will not accept autocracy, and demanding accountability from elected officials of both parties at every level of government. Of course, the most effective check will be getting a Democratic House next year that has the power of subpoena and the ability to influence what's happening on appropriations at home and abroad. With 3 new members, we get there. And one of the leaders in our effort that I'm pleased to share this part of our program with, as I mentioned, is my friend Jim McGovern. Jim is from the Boston area. He is the top Democrat, not only in charge of human rights, Atlanta's human rights effort here, but the top Democrat on the Rules Committee. And next year, when we have a Democratic majority come in, he's the one who will be playing the key role in setting the terms for the debate of every piece of legislation that comes before the House. I'm pleased to call him a friend and someone I admire and look up to on human rights issues, Jim McGovern. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman Doggett, and you've also made my job a little easier. We just want, Congressman Doggett, we just want to present you with a small token and a reminder of the events of last July. Thank you. So today is a very special day for me for many reasons. But one reason is that it's a rare opportunity for me to have the opportunity to introduce a fellow alumni of my alma mater, Berthoud Elementary School. Congressman McGovern has been my congressman representing the 2nd District of Massachusetts since 1996. He is a global leader working to end hunger, protect human rights, and promote peace around the world. As Congressman Doggett has mentioned, he is the co-chair of the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which played a critical role in the United States during the pro-democracy anti-fascism movement in terms of raising awareness and providing a platform for people who otherwise didn't have a voice. His commitment to human rights that goes back even before his time as a member of Congress, when he worked on congressional staff. Those of you of my generation and before will remember the tragic events in Central America during the 1980s and the 1990s. As a congressional staffer, Congressman McGovern led an investigation into the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter. This was an example of how human rights advocacy can lead to real changes, as this profoundly influenced U.S. policy towards Central America. Jim, if I can call you Jim, Bangladesh, he's been a great congressman in the District of Massachusetts, and has been a strong voice for the democracy movement and in favor of a stronger relationship between the U.S. and Bangladesh. So with that, Congressman.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I want to thank John for the incredible introduction and the nice build-up. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. But John holds many distinguished titles: President of Right to Freedom, former Foreign Service Officer, but most importantly, so it's really a delight to see him and to be introduced by him. I also want to acknowledge Representative Doggett, member of the Congress Human Rights Commission, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and all were allied in the fight to promote human rights abroad. The things that I admire most about Lloyd Doggett is the courage of his convictions. He kind of tells it like it is, and he's not afraid to stand and to defend the human rights of people, not just halfway around the world, so halfway down the block. And we need more members like him, and I hope we'll get it. The Tom Lantos Commission is co-chair, evaluating conditions in Bangladesh for many times over the years. And some of you are familiar faces, because I know you've been in some. In 2017, highlighted the widespread displacement and human rights violations by Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. In 2018, examined how the government's targeting political opposition groups and proponents of free speech threaten to shutter civil society and increase extremism. In 2023, we turned our attention to the journalists and government critics surveilled and attacked in advance of 2024 elections. There are rays of hope today that I didn't see then, quite frankly. A little over a year ago, students took to the streets of Doggett to demand an end to the civil service. Prime Minister Hasina, whose 15 years in power were marked by enforced disappearances and actual judicial killing, directed security forces to deploy against them. The UN Human Rights Office reports that more than 1,400 were killed in relation to that protest. Numbers people cannot appreciate what they really mean. And I know that for some of you, this is not just a number, represents parents, children, friends, neighbors. And I stand with you as you mourn those you lost. The formation of the interim government under Nobel Dr. Muhammad Yunus marked the turning point. It signaled a clear commitment to democratic reform and justice. And for the first time in many years, there is a real prospect for accountable governance and the restoration of fundamental freedoms. You know, the interim government is navigating enormous challenges, rebuilding institutions by authoritarianism, pursuing justice for past abuses, and restoring public trust. These tasks are daunting on their own, and with sustained international support, they become almost impossible. You know, when the Trump administration dismantled USAID, over 100 development and humanitarian projects in Bangladesh were forced to scale down or to shut down. Last year, the U.S. contributed 55% of all foreign aid for Rohingya refugees. Now, Rohingya refugees are less certain when they will get their next meal or a doctor's visit. And across sectors, including health, agriculture, and good governance, many organizations struggling to stay afloat precisely when it matters the most. For the United States, it's not afford to just sit on the sidelines. We must re-engage through development assistance, technical support for judicial reform and election integrity, and efforts to combat disinformation. You know, whether from a grand strategy perspective or a human rights one, it is in our interest to do so. You know, we must also be clear-eyed about what's at stake. What Bangladesh does next will not only shape the future of its 170 million people, it will send a signal to the region and the world about whether peaceful democratic transitions can succeed in the face of repression. And what the United States does next will define how credible we are when we talk about human rights abroad. You know, one of the things that worries me deeply about the current administration here in Washington, the human rights seems to be put on the back burner. And I've always felt that if the United States of America stands for anything, we need to stand out loud with foursquare human rights. I think that's what makes it unique in the eyes of the world community. People are depending on us. People want us to support efforts for freedom and for democracy, human rights. And when you've got agencies in the State Department that are committed to human rights, it sends a very bad signal. When you cut development aid and when you cut aid to refugees, it's a bad signal that somehow we're retreating from those commitments. Somehow they don't matter much anymore. And I think this is a critical time in the United States, as Congressman pointed out. And so part of our job is to not just talk about what needs to be done and make sure that we don't see the dismantling of agencies and institutions and defense and funding mechanisms designed to be part of the solution. And I want to thank Right to Freedom. I want to thank Bangladesh American Alliance and thank Research Analysis and Information for all of the hard work you do to support Bangladesh as it rebuilds its democracy. I look forward to you to work together. I hope that you will stay in touch with us at the Tom Lane Rights to make sure that we're the most up-to-date information. That if there were emergency situations that arise, call us so we can use to respond to them. But we will be there for you. We will have your back. We're not going away. And you know, I'll close with this. You know, I wear these prayer beads that were given to me by His Holiness the Dalai Lama a little year ago. I blessed me and expected him to help me deal with my negativity, my fear, and concern, and my reserves. They're not working. Anything you need for this? Look, there are a lot of challenges in the world today. A lot of challenges in Bangladesh. We have some real challenges here in the United States. And what I worry about sometimes is that people don't and whether we make any progress. I can see it. I mean, there's a fact that
mark this 1-year anniversary. What we call the July Revolution, another July has come. And yet, what have we accomplished? What are the challenges? What are the risks and pitfalls? What are the hopes and aspirations and possibilities and accomplishments? Little known or well celebrated. Those are the kinds of issues that we're going to try to touch upon. And as a result, our goal is to better inform those who care about Bangladesh or who don't, would like to learn more, would like to be more informed in a much more kind of nonpartisan, in a rigorous way that covers a range from academia to policy, to law, to activism, to advocacy, and so on. Our whole hope is that we can inform and urge continued US support for Bangladesh's fledgling democracy. And the program you have at hand highlights the topics and speakers in the 2 panels. And those who are following online, the entire events program and the live streaming and press release and the press briefing that will be held tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. All that information is available on the event page, which is at bdusalliance.org/DC, I think DC event 2025. You can figure it out. It's not hard. But it's all there on social media as well. So after the 2 panels are completed, so this is what we're doing in terms of the overall structure for the rest of the day. There will be a very quick summary and key takeaways, followed by a vote of thanks, and then we will conclude. And we invite you to stay through the morning, and we'll have a light lunch, more like refreshments, but we'll use that hour to network, get to know each other, and that is also an opportunity for everyone to ask further questions of the panelists and to engage with various speakers who may not be at the panels but have spoken before or after. And we invite you to network, get to know each other, share your business cards if you've got it. If not, there's, piece of paper. One housekeeping rule that we're going to follow for the panels is that we will have a roving volunteer who will pick up questions. We're asking you to please submit questions in writing. Everyone was given a notepad and a pen at registration. You were wondering why you're given a notepad and a pen, now you know. So you can take notes and you can submit questions in writing. You can rip out the paper and hand it to a roving volunteer. We'll bring it up front. Because we're short on time, this is why we're going to maximize it. But we're happy to speak to everyone over lunch. So that's kind of the overview in terms of, me emceeing, just very generally. So I'd like to start with the first panel. It is my pleasure to say I'm actually moderating the first panel. So this is why we set it up this way. And it is called The Lessons from the July Uprising. So I'm going to go ahead and just give the rationale for it and also invite our panelists up front in just a second. So 1 year ago, in the blazing heat of July, a people's uprising in Bangladesh. What began as a student protest quickly grew to a nationwide movement that we all know, but it was a diverse, multi-generational, and truly popular uprising. Unarmed civilians led by students deaths of young people in 3 weeks, and then thousands more injured and maimed. Yet the students and their supporters stood firm, managing to bring down a powerful and regime that had foreign support. The role of the diaspora, many of you who are in the room and away from us, but joining us in spirit, were there with our students on the streets in that moment. And that was vital. Across continents, Bangladesh mobilized, protesting, countering propaganda, pressuring foreign governments to condemn and investigate the regime's violence, and sharing footage and testimony from those inside the country. While those on the ground risked everything on the streets, those outside worked tirelessly to ensure the world paid attention. Their shared struggle created a sense of national solidarity across generations, geography, political divides. For many in the diaspora, the July Revolution actually marked a turning point in much more engaged civic engagement, which led to today's events, in case you're wondering why this long beginning. I'm getting there. What led to this co-organized event is groups of diaspora and allies and those who care about Bangladesh or have worked in Bangladesh came together to make sure that we commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the July Revolution, but also took stock of what's happening on the ground. So the energy that galvanized protests and policy briefings are evolving now into much more deeper engagement, right? People are much more politically involved and abroad. And those collaborations, and it's really single-handed collaborations, and building partnerships. The diaspora and support of the people of Bangladesh, not for the interest of action, individual, but for a vision of where governance is truly accountable to its citizens and truly serves them. The hard work of rebuilding strong democratic institutions, ensuring justice, safeguarding the rights of all has only just begun, and that is what we cover in this first panel. But we know that political transitions are fragile. Without consistent pressure, consistent resources, collective effort, we see that autocratic tendencies that were overthrown may resurface in a new form. Over the last year, many worked to highlight Bangladesh's democratic struggles so that they're not forgotten or misunderstood amidst the vast disinformation campaigns against Bangladesh that were rife and still continue. So in today's event, our goal is to emphasize the importance of supporting democratic transitions in the country and upholding principles of justice, accountability, and civil rights. In this first panel, before I introduce our panelists, we want to highlight that promoting democracy in Bangladesh and human rights while trying to stabilize the economy and handle geopolitical pressures are challenging in a post-revolutionary context. So I want to basically, that was the precursor, or rather the way to overview what we're going to cover, but each panelist covers very different items to build off of this. They will cover a range of issues from what happened in July, what aspirations there were, what reforms are being met, the roles of different and new players in the political landscape, and the prospects of sustained and improved governance and social flourishing that really takes into account human dignity. So I invite now our panel one panelist. Please come on up. So are we? So let me now introduce our panelists. Are we all here? Yes, we're all here. And hopefully everyone can still see us, right? We're a bit seated. But so we have 4 panelists. Unfortunately, each person and speaker 6 minutes, given 7 minutes, and then we can quickly move on to written questions, and then hopefully have a conversation. So, our University teaching for State University. Took place in the July uprising last year, and is a member of the University Teachers Network, non-faculty member fighting for special classes on English. University Students Union elections. Alliance. It's been to keep their comments to about 6 to maximum 7 minutes, to allow for more time for discussion and Q&A. And what we're going to do is basically get ahead and get started. And when it comes to Islamul's time, I will just highlight some of the points that he wanted everyone to be aware of. And there will be volunteers in the room who take the questions at the end. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Orumi. If you want to speak for about 6 minutes.
Greetings, everyone. I could greet everyone with a good morning, but when I look back to the experience from a year ago, the things that I have to talk about, the experiences from July and the lessons learned, well, it has just been a year, and when thinking about the lessons learned, I still think about the experiences that not necessarily me. I believe I have been privileged, or I have been protected by my peers or the people I've been with. I have not, I personally have not faced violence, but a friend who was just there with me in the morning, we have been in demonstrations, just like on the 18th of July, 2024. He was killed, and I was just beside that person. So the only things after a year, I've written so much stuff down. Like there's so many lessons that we should be taking note of. But now I wasn't sorry, I wasn't this wasn't in the schedule. When I'm trying to remember. So into a year of July, thinking about the experiences is painful, and also it's taking away 2 minutes of my 6 minutes. So as I was saying, I come from, like, I would say I have been privileged of July, when I heard that my students, they were on the streets, and this was the first time that not necessarily the student ruling party, Bangladesh Chhatra League, was using violence to stop the people on the streets, but this time they were also using weapons, less weapons starting from, say, the 15th of July. The university used to it's located in Fort Hatta, and so that place, I would say they're like, it's local businessmen and the students league there, or the police, the youth league of league, I would say they were more heavily armed. So they came down to the street as early as July 15th, and the next day, the first murder of the revolution. Over time, what we have experienced in July was nothing but violence, nothing but escalating scales of state-sponsored oppression. We did not have internet for 10 days. So that's an experience, and in contrast to that, there are lessons learned. In Myanmar, there are students, professionals. During this time of blackout, people have found ways to ensure education. People go to their and do and things of other using higher tech through, and also we observe like literally physical methods of transforming information. We just thought and we would like copy messages like maybe in the old times we just didn't have that. It was just and then as the days progressed, when more people were out in the streets, the biggest lessons learned, I would say, it was before 5th of August and also a few weeks after the 5th of August, when, well, by definition, we were governmentless in a way, and there were like a state of anarchy in places like people who have unemployed in a sense, people who used to be political cadres, like and creating this violence all over the street, all over the city. People without their leaders who have fled. These people turn to violence, or these turn to extortion in the streets, and also we of the robbery incidents right after the 5th of August. So I'm referring to these situations, and also before 5th of August, there are like women on the streets, women of different attires, and then I would also see people even finding out a place on the streets to pray. And none of them had an issue with that. Oh, I see a woman standing there or whatever she wants, and also I'm praying, and they're all comrades in resistance. These are the lessons that these experiences from July, and these are the things that we can take a note of. And then furthermore, after the 5th of August, when there were violence on religious minority communities, you would see people from the majority communities coming up and standing beside them. So this is one of the major lessons that we should be taking note of. And if I want to talk about aspirations and some other, I would say this is a disappointment. The situation of martyrs and the situation of the treatment of the injured, we have, I just want to say one sentence about this, we have completely failed. We have tried. These people who have been on the street, lost their limbs, lost their eyes, lost their children, we can never do anything to compensate or like ever bring peace to them unless we are talking about solid reforms that do not bring about any kind of dictatorship and state oppression. Even if someone with the brand of democracy comes up and gives it to us and still delivers a form of state oppression, a form of oppression on women, of religious fascism, maybe that's also another concern in Bangladesh. So these are the reforms that we could think about, that in the times to come, people will always have to rise against tyranny. People will have to reunite, reorganize all the time, but the loss of lives and they are also resources for us. They are family people. They are here to build our country and even contribute to humanity as well. So these are things, these losses. I don't think we need to go through any. Like just to name and participate in the demonstrations that were right on the street. I guess I would, for now, end here.
So we're gonna, so it's would have been here, and I'd like to very quickly point out what he said, because he's also another member of Gen Z who took part in July, and he would have gone after Arnie, and he does talk about reforms. So in terms of when he's thinking about the work that's needed, what he said is that the Prime Minister holds unilateral power to appoint heads of constitutional bodies, because he's looking at for institutional constitutional reform. So just like to highlight some of the bullet points. He wants these core constitutional laws. And then in terms of the unicameral legislature elected under the first past and post, or what is called FPTP, results in disproportionate legislative dominance. For example, parties have secured 67% of parliamentary seats, which is 3% of the vote, enabling partisan constitutional amendments. These design laws violate fundamental principles of state democracies. Quote, fair rules of the game, end quote, and, quote, neutral referees, end quote. The ruling party can dominate oversight institutions and often amend the Constitution to consolidate power. That is exactly what the former dictator Sheikh Hasina did repeatedly, where the Constitution was no longer what it had started as. The next issue is about what are the current proposed reforms by the Consensus Commission. It is to establish a bipartisan appointed committee for constitutional bodies, ensuring more impartial oversight and reducing politicization, which is exactly what Arnie was mentioning in terms of how do we prevent a return of tyranny, return of that kind of autocratic dictatorship. So we can introduce a bicameral parliament with an upper house elected by proportional representation, requiring 2/3 majority in the upper house for constitutional amendments would make unilateral changes virtually impossible, especially since no party or coalition has ever won 67% of the popular vote in Bangladesh. But what is the current deadline? So Islam goes on to say, the party expected to win the next election is resisting these core reforms to attain unchecked executive authority. Again, this is his assessment. Anyone can, disagree. But the issue that you'd also like us to think about is like public awareness of these structural issues remains low. So this is also an issue around public literacy. It makes it difficult to build pressure necessary for these kinds of reforms. People want it, but then the hard work that's necessary is harder to get done. A dangerous misconception persists that these reforms are merely matters of electoral mandate. So that's something parties can choose to implement if included in their manifesto and if they happen to win. But protecting the Constitution and its watchdog institutions from partisan manipulation is not optional. It is an essential part of democracy as is free and fair elections. If we allow executive unchecked power to control both, we don't have a democracy. We have constitutional authoritarianism. A functional democracy is impossible without broader consensus on these two foundational safeguards. So that is the most important thing that Islamul wanted to point out, and we're very, very sorry that very bad disruptive weather across the Northeast grounded his plane and he was not able to make it. A lot of our guests weren't able to make it for the same reason, but we're thankful to all of you who are here because the room is quite packed. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine. And again, please keep writing your questions, and you can mention who you are and if the question is to a particular panelist or if it's to the whole panel. So you can just write out, to whom or to the whole panel your question, and then let us know who you are if you'd like to. But you can also keep it anonymous. But guess what? We've done the mic. You would not remain anonymous. So I'm going to ask you for your name. All right, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today on behalf of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, which as an organization has worked on human rights in Bangladesh and with local civil society for over a decade. I'm going to focus my remarks on progress and challenges regarding accountability efforts for gross human rights violations that were perpetrated over the past 15 years, including potential steps that the US and broader international community may be able to take to reinforce these efforts. And first, for some context, for those who may be less familiar with the human rights situation over the past 15 years, it's well documented that Sheikh Hasina's government weaponized state institutions, including security forces and the judicial system, to silence political opponents, activists, and others expressing dissent. Such actions included extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention, including the use of politically motivated criminal cases. To give you a sense of scale, local civil society, often at great personal risk, documented over 700 enforced disappearances and 2,500 extrajudicial killings perpetrated by security forces. One of the most notorious units is the Rapid Action Battalion, or RAB, a paramilitary unit of the police that includes members funded from the military. And I think it's important to note for this audience initially received counterterrorism training from the United States. With police and judicial institutions for repression under Sheikh Hasina's government and civic space closed, there were very few options for domestic and international accountability. In this context, the US's targeted human rights sanctions regime became a critical tool which the US could take a step to reinforce the voices calling for accountability. In 2021, following advocacy from members of civil society and members of Congress, the United States Treasury imposed magnetic sanctions on RAB as a unit and 6 RAB officers, and the US State Department imposed visa restrictions on 2 RAB officers. The sanctions had a swift impact on Sheikh Hasina's government and the action of RAB security forces. In the period immediately following the sanctions, extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances dropped, and these sanctions ultimately saved lives. This background is also critical context for understanding the July Revolution because it underscores the determination and the bravery of the 1,000 students and citizen protesters who took to the streets, well aware of how the government had treated dissenting voices. As documented in the UN's 2025 fact-finding report, Sheikh Hasina and top leaders used security forces, including RAB, Detective Branch, and the Doggett Metropolitan Police to violently crack down on protesters with lethal force, committing hundreds of extrajudicial killings in what the UN said may amount to crimes against humanity. Following the regime change in August 2024, there is now the extremely difficult task of pursuing meaningful transitional justice in line with international standards, along with many institutional legal reforms to the Constitution, the judiciary, and the security sector, all within time prior to the elections in 2026. And time is short to achieve institutional change that can withstand potential backsliding by future governments. The interim government has taken some important steps towards accountability for human rights violations. One of these steps is establishing the Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearances. The Commission has now received over 1,800 complaints of enforced disappearances and uncovered at least 16 clandestine detention sites where victims were held by RAB as well as DGFI, the Director General of Forces Intelligence. The government's also taken steps to reform the International Crimes Tribunal and is moving forward with investigations and trials, though further measures are needed to ensure adherence to international standards, support capacity, and protect victims and witnesses. It's hard to overstate the current challenges facing accountability efforts. There are sharp divisions within and among political institutions, and powerful forces don't want to see accountability efforts succeed. As noted by members of the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances following a recent visit to Bangladesh, victims are deeply fearful to report cases because alleged perpetrators of enforced disappearances remain employed by security forces. Other alleged perpetrators have fled abroad to escape accountability, including some members of armed forces facing arrest warrants. The working group also reported concerns about the Army not cooperating with investigations. Last fall, the members of the Commission on Enforced Disappearances conducted inspections of clandestine detention sites and where victims were disappeared by RAB and DGFI and found recent attempts to steal and destroy evidence of abuses, including knocking down cell walls and painting over evidence or victims etched on walls. In light of these numerous challenges, I want to turn briefly to a few ways in which the US, the UN, and the broader international community may be able to support accountability and reform efforts. First, crucial maintaining on RAB. This track record of impunity demonstrates it's beyond border, and members of the military should be removed from civilian law enforcement. Reasons, theater of government should follow the recommendations of the UN and Bangladesh's forces and fully disband RAB. US and other jurisdictions with style sanctions can consider targeted sanctions for perpetrators from other security forces by the Commission and the UN's fact report. There may also be opportunities for prosecution based on universal jurisdiction against those who have fled abroad. In addition, as Bangladesh is the top contributor to UN peace missions, the UN can suspend individuals from facing credible allegations of abuse pending the establishment of a rigorous claims to prevent their participation in UN missions. The final note, international monitors also play a role in helping to address challenges of discrimination in the human rights situation by providing independent reporting assessments. Example of this is the government invited the UN fact-finding mission to conduct the investigation of what happened during the July revolution. The government also recently announced the establishment of a UN human rights in Doggett, which was opportunities for monitoring and technical assistance. Such international mechanisms can shine light in the face of potential future backsliding, so of course it's ultimately the collective responsibility of Bangladeshi citizens to determine the way forward for rights respecting future. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share a few points about human rights and accountability, and I look forward to discussing these sorts of Q&A. Thanks.
To round us off, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Tell me when I'd like to serve. I'll give you 2 minutes to remind you. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I wanted to thank Farhan and everybody else for making this possible and making actually a meaningful conversation possible. So very happy to be here. I want to set, I'm going to be a little bit more informal. I want to set the stage for my comments by reminding us of the absolutely pivotal role that young women, young women in particular, like you, played in the July uprising. It was cross classes, ethnicities, not necessarily everybody was an activist. And I think most of the audience here will be familiar, but it's worth really saluting, celebrating, and reminding us of how fearless these young people were, and young women, particularly on the streets. And the one image that I have never really forgotten is the image of a young girl who's trying to hold back a policeman that has her brother and other people in it. That's what we call courage, right? It's very clear that women have shown, that young girls and women of all generations have shown they're perfectly capable of confronting an authoritarian state and demanding rights as citizens in a democracy. They don't need to be taught. They don't need training. That's not what young people in Bangladesh need. The young women, in particular, they stepped in when their male peers went missing. They modeled for us how to speak truth to power. And I was there throughout the whole time, on the streets sometimes, not like you, but watching them speak on TV, their analysis was razor sharp. They were showing us a different face of empowerment, not empowerment as in microcredit, but I think the fruits of many years of state and NGO attention, perhaps, but also the inheritance of Bengal, where in the history of women in anti-colonial movements and movements for social states change, starting with Rokia Hussain of Sultana's fame, I do think that's important to put in there. We are a year into this, and I was overjoyed and thrilled on August 5th. We were all out on the roads. But somebody mentioned disappointment. There's a really interesting article of op-ed piece going around about a year of shattered hope. So the uprising, and I want to really address this in my few minutes first, the uprising clearly opened up a temporary space for, and it was marvelous to see, for men and women out on the streets, people, so-called secular, so-called fundamentalists, everybody was there and nobody really cared whether you were in a hijab or in a pair of jeans and you're older or younger. That's a particular moment I think all revolutionary moments have. That's gone. And what I see now, and the women seem to have disappeared, at least from the official versions of the story of the uprising. I do see tremendous despair in some quarters because the expectations were so high. But I do want to push back against the idea that women have been very big losers in post-uprising Bangladesh. I don't think that's true. And that does not mean, I don't want to underplay actual violence. A lot of women, the moral policing, things are going on, the rapes there, as have happened over time in the last 4 years. The moral policing and the violence is not new, but in a vacuum, it's very much intense. We are seeing more poverty, but it's because, and I think we really do have to understand why the violence is occurring, why and when and where, in a very situated kind of way, because it's very easy. I think it's really hard to, just say it's all backlash, or to say nothing has ever changed, or to say everything is fine. The reality is so muddied and so complex, right? So of course there was a rupture. There was a rupture with Sheikh Hasina's regime, but there wasn't, but there can be a lot of repetition because we haven't really changed our structures of governance, our policing practices, a lot of things that both of you were talking about. As Shirin Haq, who is the head of the Women's Commission, the Women's Reform Commission, which, by the way, the interim government didn't, first of all, even think of. Women's rights activists had to push for it. But as Shirin Haq said, we had the uprising, but what was still in place was the public assertion of male domination, among other things, among class inequalities, everything else. So male students became the face of the uprising, and women's bodies became sites of political struggle easily appropriated. And it seems like, and there's a real struggle over who speaks for women's rights, right? And here is where I think for policymakers or people, we've been talking about disinformation that's there, but there's something more going on. I'm sure you've all heard stories about Bangladeshi soccer players who were in football matches that were canceled, right? That goes around in the international circuit. That story travels. Of course, yes, and it is true, no match should be stopped, right? But it turns out that 66 matches, 2 were rescheduled, 1 was canceled. That shouldn't have happened. But that story takes on a life of itself because of global Islamophobia, and it serves a whole lot of other interests. This is not to underplay the threat of any kind of religious parties are there in Bangladesh because now we have a democratic space in which we have to talk through these things, right? It's going to be very, very uncomfortable. But the previous government was able to recognize and capitalize on its image of being better for women, on being protectors of secularism, and that became a cover for authoritarianism. And that is I would say, the international community, many parts of it were perfectly happy with that, right? So I think if you're a policymaker, if you thinking about things, you have to really think about who is the legitimate sort of who can speak for women, right? Who really, and what is just people making noise to be heard, as Samina Mitra, another feminist in Bangladesh, was saying about these obscure Bangladeshi Islamist groups have suddenly become very important. I want to end, I know my time is almost over, but I want to end with just two things. One is that the Women's Report that Shirin Haq headed, the Women's Reform Commission, is really pushing for extra seats in parliament. I think it's very important to have not a quota system for women, we can talk about that, but a direct elections for women in reserved seats. That makes a lot of difference. And my second thing, I do work on the garment sector, so the increased tariffs, if you want to think about Bangladesh and Bangladeshi women, Bangladesh is a global space. It's not just a national space. What happens to Bangladeshi women depends on what happens to the global economy as much as what happens inside. So the 15% tariff that we used to have is bad enough. But when you have a 35% tariff, we saw what happened during COVID. Something very similar is going to happen. And already I know Walmart and other places the Walmart suppliers are holding off on even accepting orders because they're afraid the price is just too high. It'll undermine the industry. So there's a lot that the US can do directly in terms of lobbying. And I know those conversations, maybe we can talk about that later, but there's these trade negotiations that the administration is really also trying to put in all kinds of conditionalities to get rid of, those tariffs. So it's a very mixed bag, but I think there's a lot that can be done in the US by US citizens. Thank you.
I invite folks to write down any questions you'd like to submit. We've got volunteers who are really moving them up to get the panel going while I sort through the questions. So each panelist will just take a 1 minute to comment on something. So a year into this transition, what are the most under-recognized accomplishments and overlooked risks in Bangladesh's fragile path towards democratic recovery and democratic repair? So there's accomplishments we don't pay attention to, and then there are risks that we don't see because we see other risks. So I just want to go down the table, and if folks just want to highlight, a point or two, if they can, and then we'll bring they'll submit the paperwork to me, and I'll go through that. Sorry, you want to take this away?
Under-recognized and over.
Yes. So the most under-recognized accomplishments and overlooked risks. You could identify one of each.
Under-recognized would be at least getting all these diverse people to get to sit on the same table. They weren't sitting for 15 years, and look what that got us. That got like more than 1,000 people killed because like the opposition parties were not trying to sit in one table. And also under-recognized in terms of democratic reform. I would also because I would again like to emphasize I'm a voter, I'm not a policymaker, and I'm a general public. In that sense, I would say the community level resistance that was observed during July and after August, when people were trying to in their communities fight off bouts of anarchy or how they were being exploited by local extortionists. So these community level actions are also some under-recognized achievements that would play a role in the democratic recovery of Bangladesh, because these are the voters, these are the people who will make the decision, and the political parties need to know that their speeches, their empty promises so far, just visiting people just before the elections, will probably, hopefully, not cut it out for them in the elections of 2026.
One recognized accomplishment and one possible overlooked risk.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of an international human rights organization, one recognized accomplishment is acceding to international human rights treaties. So one, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances was one of the first actions of the interim government. And then just last week, the interim government announced its intention to accede to the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And these are very important international mechanisms for monitoring and accountability going forward. And that's why I wanted to highlight them. For example, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture establishes mechanisms for regular visits to detention sites by independent experts as a means to combat and deter torture. In terms of risks, I want to elaborate a little bit more on the International Crimes Tribunal. It's difficult to cover some of the challenges in 1 minute, but I want to note in particular the overlooked risks for those who have absconded abroad and faced credible allegations of international crimes not being extradited to stand trial. There's been, of course, much discussion about the extradition of Sheikh Hasina, not to bring her India for political reasons. So I think the overlooked piece of the conversation is how the death penalty plays a legal barrier to extradition. So as a human rights organization, we would advocate against the death penalty in compliance with international fair trial standards. But I think, again, the overlooked piece is that, for example, for many European countries, the death penalty would provide a major barrier to preventing extradition for those who have absconded, and it also prevents these countries from providing support to the ICT, as well as the UN providing support for capacity challenges. So I highlight that as an overlooked risk.
Okay, one point.
I have all of your basket of goodies.
Right. I think we've, okay, in that case, I think what of the labor reform, not the Women's Reform Commission has managed to put in some really wonderful recommendations and suggestions. And as far as I can tell, it's like a basket of dreams. So we have them all written down. From, marital rape, banning marital rape, to acknowledging sex workers, to whatever else, working women's rights, it's all there in a form. It's 500, 300 extra women in parliament. These are all, many of them are not doable, but they're aspirations for women, right? And I think it's really good. I think we appreciate how much work goes into those things, right? I think that's important. The risk, from my perspective, one risk I see is there's so much critique, and critique is good, or there's so much celebration, which is also fine, that I'm afraid we might be at risk of getting why this started, which the heart was about youth unemployment and not having a future. So I think having real discussion development means, what it means, we can have endless discussions on FDI. That's not why these young men and women were on the streets. And I think we have to not forget that.
Thank you so much. So each of our panelists raised really important points. Some of them were actually answering some of the questions. So having looked through these questions, there's some great questions. So there's overlap in the questions, so maybe I'll cluster them. So there's a couple for both Dina and Orly in terms of the role of young women, and I'll read up both, and both Dina and Orly, you can take a couple of minutes to respond. So one says, Women were key to the July Revolution. This is to Dina, as you stated. But how can Bangladesh expect fundamental change so women's rights are fully respected in the new Bangladesh? And this is from Dan Mizena. Thank you. And then for Arnie, is something similar. It is, what made the student leaders decide not to take a leadership role for themselves after Hasina fled and instead turned to Dr. Yunus for leadership? And linked to the first question to Dina is from Rima. It says, how can women gain back, especially young women gain back the uprising spirits that cause change? So there's a little bit of overlap between what Arnie's comments. So for Dina, so maybe you can combine them, like how do you get back that spirit? But then also what does it mean to have effective fundamental change so women's rights are truly respected? That's for Dina. And for Arnie, why do you think the students took, created their own party and took to those roles? And then there's a question, I'm not sure who it's from, but it says, what are your thoughts on free and fair election in Bangladesh, and what are the current violations of rule of law? And for Catherine. So again, your thoughts on free and fair elections in Bangladesh and current violations, rule of law. And the other one you already answered, Catherine, which was exactly about extradition, and trials. And there's another one for Catherine, which I think you sort of covered in terms of, but I'll hand it to you while Dina and Arnie respond. So here, this is for you too. And Arnie, do you want to take it away? This is for Dina. Yeah, go ahead. You want to, yep.
I obviously don't speak for the student leaders, even though we have been distant comrades in our times at Dhaka University. I would say this actually reflects a part of humility in their part, that they did not grasp power when it was given to them. In fact, one of the advisors, Nahid Islam, he also stepped down a couple of months ago. I might be unsure of the timeline. And then he decided he would go from door to door to build politics from scratch. So I think that reflects how these people who have not thought a second about their own lives and got to the streets for freedom of speech, these people are not necessarily power hungry, violent power grabbers who just wanted to be the chief advisor of Bangladesh, and also relying on someone who is a Nobel laureate and who wants to work with the grassroots people of Bangladesh and change their lives, change the typical image of poverty that we know of Bangladesh. This person felt like someone to trust, someone who all the parties would listen to, especially how we've seen how the political landscape is of not listening to anyone. So maybe these are the based on which they chose Dr. Yunus to be a chief advisor.
Okay, I'm not sure. That's a very difficult question. That's the answer. So how do we affect fundamental change in democracy is a process, so this kind of becoming, this is all a processual thing. I would say that it's very clear that Bangladeshi women of different generations are very conscious of what they're up against. So there's a real momentum that the uprising has unleashed, it seems to me. So when there was something, when Hifaz Islam was doing whatever it was doing, women's groups, all kinds of different women's groups come together to produce this Moiti, right? It was a big deal. Like, it made a difference in the national imagination, I think. Those are the kind of things. Sort of women aren't a category, a uniform category. So women in the Chicago tracks need militarization. Let's face it, right? So, and then the garment workers need a different kind of, the right to organize. So there are I don't think we can have a simple answer to that. What I would say to, can we bring the spirit back is again, I don't think we can bring the spirit back. I think what we can do is move with the openings that have been created. So Uma Fatima, who is very, a student leader, chapter union leader, right? Who was very vocal at the beginning, has actually just resigned from the student party because she said she found it not political, not feminist enough. So that's actually, I think all of that is good. This is what we need to do. We're not going to have a magic solution where this party will give you all your rights. We're going to have to talk things through to get to a point where people agree on certain things. And the final thing I will say is that I think we've managed to get away from this very homogenizing religion, secularism binary, right? And we're just beyond just thinking about religion bad, secularism good, and thinking about what does it even mean? And whose interests are being served, right? By just constantly thinking about women's issues through religion or through something else. Women's issues are very, very complicated and intersectional.
Thank you. Catherine.
Great, and following up on a few questions related to free and fair elections, the rule of law, and then another question about balancing fundamental rights with national security. Those are very broad questions, but to make a few points, it's very important that election reform can happen before the elections. And I think it's important for that process for civil society and citizens to be as involved as possible. So I think there needs to be more opportunity for engagement with civil society and the general population on the reforms that are taking place. And I think as well, it's really important for there to be an enabling civic space for engagement, so protections for freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. And this is something that there's been very significant improvements, but it's still fraught with challenges. And so, as an example, the interim government has undertaken reviewing politically motivated cases under problematic laws such as the Cybersecurity Act, but it's a very important that for all cases where there isn't credible evidence, regardless of political affiliation, that those cases are reviewed. And so those who are being detained and charged are only where there's concrete evidence that crimes have been committed. This includes for journalists, and so it's important moving forward that there's additional protections for civic space and freedom of expression. And this also includes more engagement on reforms to problematic laws, like the Cybersecurity Act. So the interim government worked on a cyber protection ordinance to reform it. But that was an area where there would have been more engagement from civil society, and additional steps to review some of the problematic provisions like criminal defamation that had previously been used. And I think as a final point, it's also very important for international partners who want to support these efforts to make sure that they're engaging and being led by the interests of local civil society and human rights organizations to guide in how international partners can be supportive.
Right, thank you so much, President. So I'm going to go back to one of the other questions because I think there's the important follow-up. Many questions to ask. I want to turn to the role of the diaspora and the international community. Very close circle before we conclude in the next 10 minutes. If you still have questions, then let the notepad. Feel free to ask them in Bangla or English, it doesn't matter. So one of the questions going back to the role of the diaspora was how can the international partners, those in the room, those in the city, through the US and elsewhere, as well as the Bangladeshi diaspora that care about rebuilding democracy, rather than the diaspora that benefited from that cronyism and fascism and embezzled $272 billion out of Bangladesh over the last 15 years, $272 billion that we know of. in US dollars, mind you, from Bangladesh. So that's a lot of money. So those are not the people we're talking about. We're talking about the people who actually want to see something good happen to Bangladesh. All right, in terms of actual progress and actual human flourishing, all the things that are practiced identified, civic space, human rights, women's rights, education, employment, opportunity. What are the ways that we can help support make this happen? So one of the ways that one of the other questions asked was, how can we extradite? People who are living in the US, I won't speak about the other countries, but in the US and elsewhere, that in various cities, in this city, in the suburbs of the city, are there processes? Could there be some sort of way that the diaspora, the international community can help? Or, that is one example. But there are many, many ways that we can do this. How else do we support, let's say, reforms without undermining the people who are working on this inside Bangladesh, or reinforcing any form of dependency? Now we know the USAID is gone, so a lot of development projects have fallen apart, funding has fallen apart, that's livelihoods, agriculture, water treatment, malaria treatment, TB, all of those things, right? Things that funded those projects. So are there ways, so we can go down the development track, we can go down the extradition track, the law track. So that's one of the other issues. I'll let you guys just give a quick one, not more than 1 minute, because I am going to do a hard stop at 11:10, and that's 5 minutes away. So, touch on anyone.
I would like to suggest, especially for the Bangladeshi Diaspora Committee, is the National Citizens Party, the one that has been growing under the leadership of the students who have participated in the protest. We have also kept talking about voting by the diaspora community, sending mailing of ballots to the respective embassies, and so that the people who are still citizens of Bangladesh can get to vote, and also the people who are actually the backbone of the economy can get to make the political decisions they want to make for their country. So also because there are a lot of people who study policies, and also future policymakers or past policymakers here. That is why I bring this up, and maybe I could be enlightened on the topic of how could this go on. People, the diaspora community voting in the Bangladesh elections.
Thank you. Yes, I've highlighted a number of ways that international partners can engage on this, such as targeted sanctions regimes, universal jurisdiction prosecutions. Thinking here particularly where, as I mentioned, there'll be challenges in European countries for extraditions related to the death penalty, international monitoring, suspension from UN peacekeeping, and then also again underscoring the importance for all of these efforts to make sure they're very much in collaboration with and locally led civil society and human rights groups. And I think for those of us in the US, it's really important to continue to engage here with members of Congress and voting. I think it's hard to overstate the devastating impact of the AIDS cut on Bangladesh across the country, including in the Rohingya refugee camps, where there's over 1 million refugees who fled from Myanmar who are facing starvation, no health care, comes to education. And so there's opportunities for those of us in the US to engage on those points.
Okay, thanks. I just following up on that. It seems to me, as somebody who's works on the garment industry, when people, the diaspora included, when people who do in this country is really lobby Congress regarding U.S. policy, especially trade policy, in to support Bangladesh, as the Congressman Doggett said. The trade policy is at the heart of the relationship between Bangladesh and it affects people. If you really care about women in Bangladesh, then that's something you can really try and do effectively. I mean, the tariffs are just one thing, but I think there's something more to be done. I want to use 30 seconds to say one thing I should have said earlier about how to get back that spirit that you were talking about. And it's not just about young people, but the interim government has really failed in one respect, which is to really protect, like when people like Shirin Haq, who were the head of the Women's Reform Commission, were attacked as, you know, stigmatized in all kinds of ridiculous ways. There was total silence from the government, but also from civil society. It was like a patriarchal kind of silence. So the government didn't, the IG didn't say anything. That is the time people need protection of a certain moral support, right? That could have been extended, nothing more, but certainly. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie, Catherine, and Dina. In the interest of time, we'll be wrapping up in just a couple of minutes. But I see another yellow piece of paper coming up, so very quickly. Thankfully, the last two were already addressed. Maybe this has been addressed. How do we effectively establish better U.S. Bangladesh and Women's Voice platform? So that Bangladesh women are heard. I think that's been sort of addressed by what Dina said and Orly said and what Catherine said. Also, all of these are social, economic, geopolitical, human rights issues. There's no such thing as the women's issue. They're cut across, right? So when we think about it, during the brutal murder that happened in Mitford, right? Where was the John O'Gorn? Where is the public? But imagine what happened when the girl was smoking. And the outrage. So again, that's patriarchy, but it's an issue of law and order, but it's also an issue of societal norms, right? So if we want to support these things, we must bring about a change in mindsets. And I think we saw that a year ago, we saw a massive shift in mindset. So it's not impossible. So I think that's the way we get back the spirit, that spirit of the revolution, the spirit of the uprising, to bring about change for the good, not just for the few, but for the many and the all. And I think what I want to do is basically just sort of conclude and wrap up our panel. So our panel's goal was to do that overview and account for the July Revolution, and then think about the ways we can move forward. And it will segue nicely into the next panel. But I invite you all to engage with our speakers today or afterwards, and after today you can always email them. But I would like to ask you to please give a special round of applause for Orani.
Thank you, Farhana, and thank you to the wonderful panelists. This is an outstanding discussion, and hopefully it's provoked some thinking. Not only should we engage with the panelists, but I hope after today's reflect on today's events, you'll engage with each of our organizations to think about how we can work collectively toward this common goal. So as we excuse Farhana and her panelists, we'll ask Farouk Mouhideen and her panelists to move up front. We're not going to take a break. As I mentioned before, if you need to step out or come to break, feel free to do so. But otherwise, I'll hand it over to Shamroot. And then after Shamroot's panel, as Farhana mentioned, we'll have a brief wrap up, and then we'll serve some light refreshments for those of you who can stick around. Yeah. Excuse me, all take their seats, please, so we can get started. I'm in real trouble if Ambassador Museum has to wait much longer. So if everyone can take their seats.
I'd like to ask everyone to have a seat. We're about to start the next panel. In the back, if we could have some help side to just have folks sit down. Great. We'll kick off the next session, which is focused on Bangladesh and the world, as you saw on the agenda. So we're going to be looking at Bangladesh's relationship with various regional partners as well as other global partners, and all the changing dynamics in terms of politics and economics that we've been seeing over the last year, and about how Bangladesh is shifting geopolitically as well to adjust to those trends. We have a stellar panel to discuss these issues. I'll be introducing them here in a second. I know that trade issues are top of mind for many folks, but we hope to not limit the discussion to those issues, but just broadly around how Bangladesh can engage with all those different partners. So to my right, I have Michael Kugelman, who is the South Asia columnist for Foreign Policy Magazine and also Senior Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He's a thought leader on U.S. policy in South Asia, and until recently was founding director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute. He writes often on South Asia issues for Foreign Policy magazine, including for a weekly brief. His recent projects are focused on U.S.-India technology cooperation, the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations, and U.S.-Afghanistan relations. He speaks frequently to media outlets, as well as has written for a number of newspapers and so on, including the LA Times, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Politico, and others. And Michael has really been a thought leader on Bangladesh's transition to democracy as well. So I hope to kind of hear about foreign relations in the context of that. To Michael's right, we have Ambassador Mozina, who is, as many of you know him, has served in Bangladesh from 2011 to 2014, and is one of the biggest champions of Bangladesh. I think he's the only ambassador who might have gone to every district in Bangladesh, really going out of his way to visit across the country. And he's had a 38-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, and his other foreign assignments included were in Zambia, DRC, India, Pakistan, of course, in Bangladesh before as well as political and economic counselor. He also, during his career, facilitated South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy, and he's been a professor of national security affairs at the National Law College in DC, and has mentored junior foreign service officers. And Ambassador Mozina is originally from Iowa, state that he loves. And then to his right is Ehtishamul Haq. And Ehtishamul Haq is with one of the sponsoring organizations here. He's with BRAIN, which is one of the groups putting today's event together. And he's the lead of operations for BRAIN, and also adjunct professor at American University. He's an experienced corporate lawyer with over a decade of experience serving as an in-house counsel as well as outside general counsel for major corporations across the tech sector. And he serves as principal attorney at his own law offices, and also has served in legal roles at different Fortune 500 companies. And also an interesting detail about Ehtisam's background is that he's also been involved with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, doing some of their communications work during 2022-2023. So I might actually come to you for questions about the BNP, given your experience with them. And then last but not least, we have Moshmi Khan, the senior advisor at the Asia Group, just landing yesterday from Bangladesh to DC. So thanks for cutting through the jet lag and being here. And she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Most recently, she was the U.S. Alternative Executive Director on the board of directors of the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Prior to that, she lived and worked in Bangladesh for about 10 years, where her last role was as CEO of Nirapon, which is the successor organization to the North American Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety. She currently advises companies and organizations on strategy, governance, and impact in emerging markets. So really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Shamara Muhyuddin. I'm with the Cadmus Group, which is a global consulting firm here in DC, advising the US government and private sector. And I spent a lot of my career working on US-Bangladesh relations, so know a number of you in the room from that experience as well. And currently running the Bangladesh Project, which is a DC-based advisory group for policymakers. So I'll first start off with the broad questions to each of you. So if I could ask each of you to give remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes about specific topics, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. And if you have questions during the remarks from the panelists, please do write them down, because we're going to come to Q&A quite quickly. So if you could just start writing down your questions, then we'll have a volunteer go around and start collecting those. So I'll first turn to Ambassador Mozina, given your role in the past serving as U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh, and since then also following Bangladesh issues so closely. What is, in your opinion, sort of kind of what the interim government should do in terms of approaching U.S.-Bangladesh relations, as well as for future elected government in Bangladesh, and also for the U.S., what should the U.S. prioritize in terms of its relationship? Of course, we won't have everything we're looking for, but in your view, what should be the U.S. priorities in Bangladesh? And you feel free to take a broader look at these issues as well.
Thanks a lot, Shamaruk, and thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Special thanks to my former partner, John Danilovich. He and I were 2 years together with TACA. Thank you and all the organizers for making this event happen. And Farhana, great thanks to you and your panel wow, you set a real foundation for this discussion. So Shamaruk just put out there the question for me. It's a very narrow question. I'm going to try real hard to stay in that lane. That's not easy for me. It's a tough question because everything is so fluid right now. Look at DACA. Look at Washington. There's a lot of moving pieces here. So there's no clear, easy answer to Shamaruk's very good question. So I thought what I would try to do is just take a look at some of the recent developments, try to look at the context so we can understand better the U.S.-Bangladesh evolving bilateral relationship. Big, surprising things are happening in both countries. We just heard in some detail about the July revolution in Bangladesh. But as I will come to in a few minutes, big things are happening in Washington. So first, looking at Bangladesh. Bangladesh has had revolutions before. We know that. None of them has institutionalized democracy. They've given us, what have they given us? One-party rule, military dictatorship, 15-year autocrat. But the leaders of the July Revolution, maybe they've broken that mold. Maybe. They didn't have a big fight over who's going to sit in the big chair. Can you imagine this? This is not how things are supposed to happen, but they didn't. Instead, they turned to Professor Mohammed Yunus, and he was the perfect choice, I think, the perfect choice to lead that nation to sustainable democracy and development. What a great surprise those student leaders were for me. And it gives me hope that this revolution, unlike all those other ones, this one will be different. And I'm inspired by Yunus's leadership and his determination to lay the groundwork, the foundation for democracy and continued development in Bangladesh. I know all about the challenges and the obstacles. We heard about them in the last panel, but my money's with Yunus and the people of Bangladesh. I think they're going to pull this off. But Bangladesh is not alone in having big surprises. I don't know about you, but I never saw coming at me what has happened in America in the last 6 months. I didn't see that coming. I didn't anticipate that America first actually virtually means America alone on the international stage. We're going it alone as we advance our interests. I did not anticipate the dismantling of USAID and those other elements of our toolkit to promote soft power. I didn't see any of that coming as America now shifts to other forms of power. I didn't anticipate the fundamental changes of America's tactics and goals and strategy on the international arena. I didn't see that. So big surprises in Dhaka, big surprises in Washington. And this is all still playing out. It's very fluid, but some things are not changing. Bangladesh and America each matters to each other. Peace, security, and prosperity. Bangladesh needs America. And we heard America, the largest market, the number one or two source of remittances, huge investor, innovative investor in Bangladesh, and of course helping to support 1 million Rohingya refugees and other things, but time's running out. Needs Bangladesh. Sometimes we forget Bangladesh is the 8th largest country in the world. Sometimes we forget. Bangladesh is a modern Muslim majority nation whose economy is whose economic growth, and now its emerging democracy hold potential to offer the developing world, especially the Islamic developing world, a model, an alternative to violent extremism and despotism. So the challenge is how will the US and Bangladesh find each other in these much changing circumstances so each can advance its self-interest. So let's just take a quick look at that. I am so encouraged by Bangladesh's engagement with America on trade and tariffs. Those are the priorities of this administration. You can like them, you can not like them, it doesn't matter. That's where Washington is. And I think Eunice and his team, I think they swallowed very hard, but they're at the table and they're trying to engage with America. It is not easy. The interim government must sustain this engagement. It must find a way to move forward. As we heard earlier, 35% tariffs would really kill Bangladesh. And the interim government must sustain its efforts to increase Bangladeshi imports of American goods, aircraft, energy, cotton, a long list of things, because this is what matters to Washington. And Bangladesh must find a way to connect. I think American RMG importers must also help the current administration understand how important Bangladesh is to America. You go to Walmart, you're buying Bangladeshi clothes, and that's where America is shopping. We need Bangladesh. And I believe Bangladesh, the government of Bangladesh, I hope the Sharjah is around, needs to clarify to the administration the role it can play in advancing stability in the Indo-Pacific region. America says that the geostrategic interest of our country, Bangladesh is critical to advancing that. And the diaspora, we've heard a good discussion about the diaspora. They can play a role in this. They need to reach out to the congressional people here. We had two wonderful representatives here earlier today, and we have staff members still here. Need to reach out to them to promote a deeper understanding of Bangladesh's role in advancing U.S. interests. That's an important part. Bangladesh, of course, has many friends here. Just met two of them a minute ago. And Bangladesh needs to engage these friends, urge them to bring greater understanding that a close, productive, bilateral partnership benefits both countries. I'm underscoring that point virtually. And I hope, too, that Bangladesh's friends on the Hill will urge an early appointment of a new U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh. That position has been vacant for a year. Now, we have a really good Sharjah out there, but she needs an ambassador. The two can partner together and promote our interests. And I hope Bangladesh will help out our Sharjah here, who is working so hard, so he can have a new ambassador here too. So, turbulent times in our bilateral relationship. I don't have any neat response to Shamaruk's question. It's uncharted waters. I don't know how this bilateral relationship is going to play out. 35% tariffs takes my breath away. The only certainty I have is that the stakes of this bilateral relationship are high for both countries. Bangladesh and America need each other. And it's the best interest of both countries, to forge strong bilateral ties. And our challenge, each of us sitting in this room right now, our challenge is to play our respective parts to help America, to help Bangladesh find a way to forge that mutually beneficial bilateral
very strongly for having very constructive, strong bilateral relations. Here's a little bit focus on the other around the world. We've studied relationships with the region, with India, others, as well as other China. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about, as Bangladesh is thinking about realigning with these different countries and focusing on a more equity-based foreign policy, because I think one of the things that came up during the uprising is that some of the diplomatic arrangements were a bit one-sided. So I think that there is a focus on making some of the kind of bilateral relationships a bit advantageous for Bangladesh for many reasons. So I would love to hear your thoughts about where you see this relationship going and what kind of implications that has on U.S. policy as well as the U.S. considering its policy in the region.
Thank you, John Rook. I should say I'm really happy, really honored to be part of this event, and I express gratitude to the organizers for inviting me. There are not enough discussion events on Bangladesh in this town. As you say, the world's 8th most populous country. Many folks in this town would not necessarily realize that. You all do, but we do not. Not even after the tumultuous and highly consequential events of the last year, not enough discussion on Bangladesh. So I really appreciate the hosts for hosting this, and I'm grateful to be here. So to your great question, we heard in the previous panel about all the massive changes in Bangladesh's politics this last summer, but I would argue that on the external front regarding Bangladesh's foreign policy, the changes have actually not been quite as great to this point. So let me explain. His departure did pave the way for big changes on Dockett's foreign policy front. That's very clear. That involves India. Hasina had special relations, or I should say, special relationships with Modi's and the BJP, but also, let's not forget, with Indian opposition. Look at his family. Her father had close ties with the Congress, with the Gandhi family in India. So, indeed, post-Hasina, Bangladesh's relationship with India has become more tense. That's very clear. Created openings for Dhaka to pursue former ties with China. Hasina did strengthen ties with China. Don't forget that. Chinese infrastructure investment, to arms sales. There were some stated that Dhaka had to be careful not to cross, particularly anything that could undercut India's security interests. Post-Hasina, those red lines are not present, and New Delhi's influence over Dhaka is nowhere near as great. So Dhaka's over engagement in China is larger. Meanwhile, similarly, post-Hasina, Dhaka now has opportunities to explore setting ties with Pakistan, who did not advance much at all during the era. Over the last year, we've seen China and Bangladesh affirm their partnership in a big way, with China pledging lots of investment, including the project to modernize the Bangla port, which of course is the second largest port in Bangladesh. Dhaka has showed its comfort level with pushing back against India, such as when Uniswal in Beijing earlier this year downplayed public speech, downplayed the geostrategic importance of the northeastern United States and dismissed them as landlocked states with no access to the ocean. It's to imagine Sheikh Hasina or anyone from our government saying something. While we've seen significant steps in Dhaka to kickstart trade with Pakistan. More broadly, there's a series of high-level engagements, including some between Bangladesh and Pakistan, which has not pleased India. Bangladesh warship participated in the Aman naval exercise hosted by Pakistan. This year is the first time in about 10 years that Bangladesh participated in those exercises in that way. But here's the thing, coming back to what I said at the start, despite this, I'm not didn't really sense any shifts, any major shifts, aside from the fact that relations have grown more tense. Doggett has been cut off ties to Delhi. There are series of high-level engagements between the two governments, including Dr. Yunus in private in Bangkok some months ago. I would argue that the nature and tenor of Bangladesh's cooperation with China has nearly continued what we'd already been seeing, in past years. As for relations with Pakistan, so far it's been mostly more exploratory than operational. Scaling up bilateral trade between Bangladesh and Pakistan requires some creativity because both states, one would argue, are natural competitors, not partners, because they both have similar emphases towards garments, and of course, in the case of the RMGs. So a useful case study that I'll cite here is something that happened just a few weeks back. Senior diplomats from Bangladesh, China, and Pakistan met at a China-South Asia summit in China. So the Chinese and the Pakistani government accounts of the meeting depicted this gathering as a big new thing, the start of a new trilateral cooperation mechanism. Dockett's reading out was more subdued. It didn't make any promises of future meetings. It seemed to distance itself from this three-way meeting on the whole. So what could have been at play here? Why this reaction? Just throw out a few considerations for context. One, there might be hesitation now within the interim government for an unelected administration to commit to a new arrangement that might be perceived as alliance, which would have to significant foreign policy shift for Bangladesh, given that Bangladesh has always had an allying policy formally with no alliances. It's one thing to push closer to China and Pakistan, but it would be something completely different to engage in alliance-like behavior. Also note that some of the sharpest critics of India within the interim government in Bangladesh have been the student leaders, and many of, I should say, these student leaders are folks that Dr. has tended to defer to. Many of these student leaders have left the government. Some of them have left the government recent months to form their own party, then to form their new party and throw it out. And so that suggests now space within the interim government for more moderate voices. If we widen this and look at Bangladesh's foreign policy beyond the region over the last year, there's generally been a fair amount of consistency with what we saw in the Keynote era as well. We've seen efforts to pursue ties with key trade partners in Europe and the U.S., with critical energy and commercial partners more broadly in the Middle East. Since its independence, Bangladesh's foreign policy has been governed by this mantra of friendship to all, malice toward none, coined by independence leadership. Rahman, Sheikh Hasina's father. Now, for political reasons, you're not going to hear members of this interim government invoking that mantra. I think policy has remained in place. That said, in great part because of all the tumults in today's world order, Bangladesh is going to face challenges in the coming weeks and months. So I'll close by just identifying three foreign policy challenges that the interim government, especially the next one, one is the relationship with India. That's very clear. There's been strong India in Bangladesh, which is not new. We see increased over the years. So people I've argued that Doggett cannot afford to lose India for reasons tied to key interest range, persecutes economic need, as well as connectivity. The quiet success story over the last year was the inauguration of electricity sharing between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. There's a strong chance that Bangladesh's next government will be led by the BNP. I'll let those with more place kind of needs to be met. But I suspect the government in which the BNP has a significant role will want to explore setting ties with Doggett. I would know it. And Delhi, again, this is my sense, Delhi, knowing that the BNP has ended its alliance with Jamaat, will probably be keen to look into reciprocate. My understanding is that his main concern when it comes to political parties in Bangladesh is Jamaat. Still, for Doggett, managing these expectations in combination with the anti-India sentiment, each side's grievances about the other, from Hasina's presence in India, she's not going to be sent back to Bangladesh. Let's make that very clear. to Indian disinformation campaigns, widening space for religious actors in Bangladesh. Managing all that will be very difficult. Separate foreign policy challenges ensuring the security of Bangladesh's assets, interests, and equities in the Middle East amid the continuing volatility there that's unlikely to end anytime soon. But like many other South Asian states, Bangladesh relies on energy supplies in that region. More broadly, it relies on key trade routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, to import goods, but also to send exports westward to key markets like Europe and the US. Bangladesh doesn't have the luxury that India does of being able to turn more to widely available supplies. And on a related note, you'll notice Bangladesh has a large number of expatriates working in the Middle East that send back remittances that make a key contribution to what is now a shaping economy. You have stability, instability, conflict picking up in the Middle East that prompts evacuations of these expatriates. Bangladesh's economy could be impacted because of the remittance factor. Third final challenge for DACA, and I'll wrap up here, and it really gets no attention at all in Washington, but it's important. The war with Myanmar, it's the Arakan Army, which is a potent armed group. It controls most of the 160-mile border with Bangladesh. That's strategic real estate, along the northeastern beaches of the Bay of Bengal. Our prohibited group pledged that the Arakan sought to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. There's a really good international crisis report analysis of the very issue I advise you all take a look at. This, even as DACA has sought to engage the Arakan army while carefully managing ties with the Myanmar. This is a major minefield that DACA will need to navigate. So I was going to say something about the challenge of relations with the US, but I think Ambassador Moses did a great job of that. So, thank you.
Have a number of points. Without wasting, I'll move on to Moshami Khan, and I'll come to you at the end. Moshami, you've spent a lot of your time at the Asian Development Bank and have a long career on global economics as well. Your thoughts on Bangladesh's economic challenges and its positioning with partners around investment relationships, what we should be hoping for from the interim governments and for future elected governments, especially in terms of creating employment and a stable economy, robust private sector growth. Are the key conditions that are the underlying factors for all of that? Because we also know that in terms of the uprising, a key grievance that students had was around employment, right? It started with the job quota reform movement. So private sector growth and employment, these are really important questions and really key to stable democracies, right? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on how Bangladesh can position itself and what observations on what's happening already.
Thank you. I'd like to first begin by thanking the organizers of this. I know how difficult it is to be a Monteverdi, because I hope I said it right, to herd cats. So I really appreciate the convening of a diverse group of organizations. Also, the fellow panelists, as some of you are to hear perspective, and I think some of these issues that were raised earlier will also touch upon your questions. And then lastly, I would really like to thank the audience and U.S. policymakers who have been here. We are sitting in the U.S. Capitol, and we've had some great speakers earlier. I can't emphasize how important it is to have a really grassroots frontline perspective on what's happening, because it does impact geopolitics and the economic relations with the U.S. But before that, though, I'd like to give my deepest respect and admiration for the students and all those killed for this revolution, because it's really, that's the reason we're here today. And then also migrants, workers who actually are the basic of why Bangladesh's economic remittances and the economy stands. I really want to start by saying that, because I think that's something that might be overlooked in terms of this larger discussion. And then the three actors that I want to discuss, we talked about it earlier, the government, Bangladesh, the interim government, let's keep managing relations, and really keep in line with the interim government who came for a period of time for a very specific task. And then MDB's Multilateral Development Bank, as you mentioned, I did spend a few years at the ADB as the US the board, as well as the private sector. So looking at the government, looking at the role of MDBs, and looking at the private sector. But before I do that, I wanted to give some context to my own thinking about the revolution and the economy and geopolitics because of the excellent first panel. As I was listening to the panel, it's really struck me how this news traveled and what happened. And I remember last July where I was on a cruise, a family cruise to Alaska. And my, at the time, 14-year-old daughter said, "Oh my gosh, something's happening in Bangladesh." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "There's a protest outside the street of where we usually live in Bangladesh." And she heard about it from TikTok and she heard it from some other folks there. So I want to mention this because we heard this in the middle of an ocean in I think close to Alaska by that time, but it's not something that was on my radar at all. Secondly, a family member on a family WhatsApp group said Abu Saeed had just died. I have to admit, I never knew. But apparently he was a genius scholar of the Center for Zakat Management, an organization that was run by one of our, something that our families were connected to somehow. So Abu Saeed was a young student, as you know, and he was killed. And so the family member just said, "I know many of you have met him and this has happened." Again, it didn't register. And I get back to ADB and I'm having lunch, and by this time it's very clear what has happened. I'm having lunch with some senior management folks, and they said, "You know, the internet, it almost caused the lack of internet in Bangladesh, caused Bangladesh on a very large level." And I say that because all of these disparate kinds of things happen in the middle of an ocean of finding out that young people have these geopolitical, very international implications. So that's the context in which I came to learn of this revolution. But then let me also bring you back to my stint and my time in Bangladesh, which as a Bangladeshi American growing up in Michigan, I really had not spent much time in Bangladesh except these 10 years where I met a lot of old friends, including some sitting here. And I wanted to say that 2010, I remember May 8th, I think is when May 11th was my first day on the job, I believe. I was recruited by BRAC to be their first legal and director of legal compliance. At the time, you may have known that the attacks against Dr. Yunus were starting by the government. The reason I bring that up in this capital, in this time, in this context, is because what the U.S. does has long-term implications. Very happy to see a fellow human rights advocate and a lawyer here, because how we choose to respond to things, whether we have these sessions or not, have a direct impact. And so I'm extremely heartened by our congressional leaders who specifically tie not only what's happening in Bangladesh to what's happening here in America today, around the block and around in the room, but also really what's happening in terms of, in the context of Bangladesh. At the time, I had worked up to you in 1993 to myself. I'm as old as Bangladesh. And so my first boss, I remember being alarmed, like what were all these attacks against him? And a very good friend said to me, "Mo, you can't afford to get involved in this fight." And this is someone who very smart, very well-intentioned, very senior in government and very wise. The reason he said it is because I had something to lose. I had moved to Bangladesh, my husband's business, and business could actually licenses. At that time, this is something that we now 10, 15 years later can actually appreciate, but this is to the role of the private sector and the government and in terms of what the international roles can play. And so I have a back road, and I'm not very much of a revolutionary except in my heart. So I need to understand how better to kind of bring hearts and minds together. But at this time, the US government made a tactical decision. The decision the US government took was to take a hands-off approach. And at the time, President Sheikh Hasina knew she had India at her back. And so she went all in against Yunus, against a lot of these movements. And the reason I mention that, not just because I was an intern and a disciple of the whole, working at Grameen, etc., but really because it had ramifications of where she knew how much she could push. Those 15 years, what we do today, the policymakers, the staff who are here, it is so important for you to understand that one small thing, what you do or do not do, what you say or do not say has long-term implications, not just for Bangladesh, but for the region. And I'll come back into what the question you're asking me, but the regional implications, the geopolitical regional implications of what happens in Bangladesh is not just because it's the 8th largest country in the world. As my mom always says, if you don't learn Bangla, someday you're going to realize what it might even be a UN language, she says. I'm not sure about that, but it did, there is a UN movement in terms of the language movement and international mothers language data country first. But in terms of actually the role the government now has in we talked about how this protest started. The protest started because of unemployment. The protest started because there was economic disparity. That's why I know for sure Trump was elected in my home state of Michigan, because people felt disenfranchised. I know that there's economics at the heart of many political actual what happens in politics. And if this government is going to make a change, is going to sustain some of that spirit of what happened, then I would urge that we look at the three big issues: I, D, and C. Infrastructure investment, D as in digitalization, deregulation, and also diplomacy, and C as in connectivity, corridors, and cooperation. So first, let's look at the first I, infrastructure. As ADB, World Bank, others have made fundamental improvements and investments in Bangladesh to improve their roads and their highways, and they're really prioritizing. I just was very lucky to meet with my colleagues at the ADB just yesterday, or actually 2 days ago, I guess it's fine, where they talked about the country partnership strategy for ADB and Bangladesh. That partnership is going to rest on two pillars, really looking at diversification of the economy and really to buttress against any kind of headwinds of if there's going to be with LDC graduation, with also kind of the shocks of the environment, of the shocks of all of the, COVID, post-COVID, all of these things. And then lastly, looking at improving cooperation in the region. So the government will have a very strong role to play in terms of, having strong infrastructure to allow these economic things for these, people to have jobs and to have connectivity. And then secondly, in terms of the multilateral development banks, their job will to be playing a role of not just funding, but in partnership with the government as a knowledge partner, as a funder, and to provide oversight. And here I want to emphasize the importance of governance, where MDBs can play a very important role. In fact, they must play a role, and where the U.S. is the largest shareholder in many of these MDBs, has to play a very important role, is that if we don't actually see what governance, if we're investing into vaccine factories that happen to be a certain region because someone lives there, but there's no local capacity to actually do that, or that vaccine entity will be done with a very corrupt local health entity, which is exactly what happened in the past, then that is something that we have to understand as part of a larger, development story of a country like Bangladesh. So MDBs have not just a fundraising and a technical assistance role, but also a governance, oversight, and funding enabling role. Lastly, in terms of private sector, I think we were discussing, and I'm sure we can get into a lot of this later, and I'm sure I'm probably going to be at time, so I'll just say a couple of things about this. The private sector has to be key to what's happening, because the private sector, and as much as I very much always agree with Dina Siddiqui, I would really urge us to reconsider how important FDI is. Foreign direct investment is critical to Bangladesh today and Bangladesh tomorrow. It is critical to Bangladesh today and Bangladesh tomorrow. And the reason it's critical is because Bangladesh is amongst the lowest FDIs, as well as the lowest taxes in the region compared to its GDP, compared to its, everything else. If those two rates don't increase, Bangladesh actually cannot maintain the growth and the hopes of people like Orni and others who sacrifice for this country. So the private sector, I can get a lot into it, some of the barriers to it, some of the banking sector, all of that. Hopefully some of that will come up in the questions. But I want to end with those 3 points: the importance of the government, the importance of multilateral development banks, the importance of the private sector to sustain and to carry on the spirit of what the people of Bangladesh actually started, and the important role the U.S. government and U.S. policymakers here and always have a role to play in that.
Excellent remarks, and I think you tied the foreign policy issues that came up earlier very well to the economic issues and how these economic arrangements are so key to approaching these partners around the world too. Going now to Ehtesham Haq, I'm going to come to you really to focus a bit on the future, because we all know that BNP is sort of leading in the polls and for the elections. So there are questions about what is the BNP's vision for foreign policy as well. And we're talking about Bangladesh in the world. So as you're sort of consulting with various people within the party, like what are some of the main focus areas for Bangladesh's relationship with the US if the BNP is to assume office next year, as well as with India?
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the organizers here. First,
in true Bangladeshi style, I'll start with a caveat. I'm only an observer, not affiliated in any way, and had the good fortune to volunteer at some points, and can only speak from that vantage. So I think the tricky thing for BNP is that if and when under a free and fair election it takes power, for it, it'll be, whichever year the election happens, maybe 2026, we're hoping. But it will also be starting from 2006, the last year when BNP was in power. And the government had taken some steps which had coalesced various regional and international forces to think that a BNP government would not be in its best interest going forward. And that is what it needs to handle if and when it comes to power next. And I think when we talk about the struggle against Sheikh Hasina and her 15-year rule, there are many entry points where we can start the narrative. But the one I always jump to is 2021. The world is sort of recovering from Bangladesh has just had an election in 2018, following another fraudulent election in 2014, which Ambassador Mutina here and John got to see from the front rows, and I'm sure had some thoughts about. And the tricky thing about Sheikh Hasina was that she was a master of form over substance. You would try to go to someone and explain what was so insidious about the Hasina regime, and they would be like, but there is a parliament, there is opposition, you have rallies, so, what's going on? And it would really take someone who was invested in Bangladesh to get the horror and the lived experience of facing oppression under RAB, which, my friend from the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center mentioned. The state security apparatus, the digital policing, and really speak up for human rights and democracy. So after 2018, another sham election takes place. In 2021, we get the Magnitsky sanctions against RAD. And that really represented a sea change in that we have become used to seeing the Hasina regime acting with complete disregard for law, norms, governance, regulations, and still go abroad and get recognition at UN functions, be treated as a serious partner in world campaigns. And in 2021, those sanctions, I think, sent a message that no, the world was taking notice, there was a rupture, this was not how things were supposed to be. And then, the great work by the Biden administration in focusing attention on the elections that would take place in Bangladesh was really heartening to the diaspora in the US and around the world in sort of coalescing and sort of trying to make sure that this time our voices would be heard. The 2024 election was, another triumph of form over substance. Sheikh Hasina had gotten emboldened to such an extent. She wanted to have her party people be the opposition and the governing party. And that sort of set the stage for what we saw a year earlier in July and August, where finally we could go to the world and show what was going on. That people are being shot in the streets for, demanding their God-given rights, for demanding their constitutional rights. So with that context, I think a lot of what I said now pertains to Bangladesh's relationship with the US, that Bangladesh has looked to the US as a font of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. While the fidelity to those may maybe shift from time to time, I think the long-term trend does not waver. We all have a very favorite saying, the struggle of mankind against tyranny is the struggle of memory versus forgetting. And it's very important we don't forget the road that led us to last July and August, and the fact that we are sitting here in the Capital Visitor Center and talking about democracy in Bangladesh now. For India, I think there is, I mean, not to be too dramatic about it, but there's a huge upside to Bangladesh and India elections under the next elected government, taking small confidence building measures and sort of, moving to a place where things can be accentuated on a basis of mutual gain and mutual respect. I'll share a small anecdote. In October 2023, 3 months before the election, Hasina launched a brutal crackdown, arrested what we like to call the usual suspects, the senior leadership of the pro-democracy movement. One of the almost last things BNP did before that was to put out its India-Pacific strategy, where it talked in detail about how it saw the world be going forward. And it made very clear its commitment to the rule of law, a law-based system in and around the Pacific, and the fact that Bangladesh had to throw its lot with the democracies of Asia and the West. And then I think what Michael mentioned very succinctly is the relationship with Myanmar. And I think there's a sense right now, just with everything going on in the world, that national borders don't mean as much as they used to. Drones are flying in, bombs are being exploded in places very far away from borders. So Bangladesh needs to be very careful about the situation with Myanmar and proceed in a way that reflects an all-party consensus. Michael raised a very good point that regarding Bangladesh, there's an all-party consensus in India. So not only BJP, but the Indian National Congress and other parties were all unanimous that the fallen dictator Sheikh Hasina be treated as a favored guest in India, be kept, in a VIP villa and given a lavish life. I think it's in the best interest of Bangladesh as well to coalesce and have an all-party consensus on these very important issues going forward. Coming to an end, whenever I would speak to the pro-democracy activists in Bangladesh and ask them, what can we do? The answer would always be the same. Tell our story, talk about us, let the world know that we are fighting for these things, that the world says it values, and they should, stand up and count for us. And Representatives Doggett and McGovern were signatories in so many letters highlighting the situation in Bangladesh in 2021, 2022, 2023. They deserve a big vote of thanks from us. And I'd like to think that all of us in this room can be sort of the stakeholders and coalition for preserving the movement that toppled the dictatorship last year and brought democracy back. And I want to end in a note of positivity. We are immeasurably better off than we were a year ago, and I hope we can build on that. Thank you.
I'd love for our volunteers to start collecting questions from the audience. And if you're still writing your questions, feel free to take your time to write them as he goes around. And so thank you everyone for your initial remarks. I think we covered a lot of ground. I hope some good questions come up. One broad question I had for anyone who'd like to take it is obviously, Bangladesh is gaining in a lot with this relationship with China. And that's is something the US is tracking very closely on the Hill. And I think that there are certain US views, no matter the administration here, about kind of countries in the region having stronger relationships with China. So I would love to hear your thoughts about how you see that relationship and what are some of the pros and cons, and in terms of human rights issues too, that comes up quite a bit as well in the context of China's involvement in Africa. So would love for you to take a broader view at economic issues, but also broader governance and human rights issues. And Ambassador Mosina, you wanted to underscore the development success story of Bangladesh. And you've done that many times when you were there as ambassador as well. So now that the USAID has kind of folded, there's really not too many mechanisms for the US government to engage on development issues in Bangladesh. I'm wondering, beyond trade, which we're kind of in a waiting mode for that, what do you see as some of the mechanisms for engaging on development